meaningful and democratic development, and as a way of leading to greater safety and more peace for citizens. One logistical note, we have live interpretation accessible in French and Spanish. You can find the interpretation button in the menu at the bottom of your screen with the symbol of the globe. Please choose between English, Spanish, or French to access your preferred language. You can also access closed captioning in the menu as well. And now it is my pleasure to welcome Undersecretary Zeya, who will provide opening remarks. Undersecretary Zeya has long been a champion of a more holistic security governance framework, doing so both in government and out of government. Again, you can find her bio as well as the entire program in the link that Beitel Hailu will drop in the chat box. Undersecretary Zeya, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you so much, Kehinde, and it's wonderful to be among dear friends and former colleagues. I'm pleased to address you all today on how we can respond to the challenges and opportunities for supporting democratic approaches to security governance. I'd like to thank Humanity United, Search for Common Ground, the Alliance for Peacebuilding, USIP, for convening this timely and important discussion with such a diverse and impressive set of panelists. This discussion comes in an important time as we've seen a concerning, sustained trend of democratic backsliding throughout the world. There are many facets to the challenges facing our democracies, but we have no doubt that we must tackle them together. And I'm glad to be here today to discuss an important component of the democratic renewal conversation, how we can work together to rethink security sector assistance as a component of meaningful democratic development, leading to greater safety and peace for all citizens. The United States is working on this at home. For example, the White House identified criminal justice reform as a top priority to combat systemic racism and address structures, policies, and practices in the United States that contribute to inequality. This is not only a domestic priority, but a national security imperative, as in the United States, underserved and marginalized groups and countries around the world face inequitable treatment, stereotypes, profiling, and human rights violations that impede justice and damage the credibility of governments. Our challenge here at the State Department is to learn from US domestic efforts to address bias and discrimination, improve oversight and accountability, and strengthen transparency in our criminal justice system, and to apply those lessons as we build coalitions to advance the rule of law and promote human rights at the international level. We also must continually work to incorporate human rights, ethics, and diversity, equity, and inclusion principles in US assistance for criminal justice and security sector authorities overseas. We in the department, like you, seek to promote democratic approaches to security sector governance worldwide. The security sector often plays a decisive role in the political trajectory of emerging democracies. Supporting security sector governance means promoting security forces that respect human rights and uphold the rule of law, abide by international humanitarian law, and are held accountable when they don't. Security sector partners should be under effective civilian control and committed to improving transparency and countering corruption. We actively work with our partners to make advances towards these common goals, ensuring we're participating with trusted security force counterparts who share that vision. Integral to this mission is the work of civil society organizations in helping inform these efforts and holding us to account. Security sector governance is a social contract. Security forces are entrusted with the monopoly of force, which they must wield in a way that protects and respects the human rights of all a nation's citizens. Building positive relations with the people they serve and building diversity, equity, and inclusion into these forces so they reflect their own populations is critical to creating truly democratic security institutions. Civil society plays a vital role in holding governments accountable to this social contract, and academia and professional organizations play an important role as well in setting standards, supporting evidence-based practices in learning, and promoting inclusive policies. In action, the State Department seeks to support security sector governance by training, equipping, and helping build the institutional capacity of partner forces to enhance compliance with their human rights obligations and international humanitarian law. We leverage the expertise of US state and local criminal justice agencies to share best practices and mentor foreign counterparts. We work with US agencies that embody the values that we want our foreign partners to build. Our support for security sector governance varies widely from country to country and intentionally considers the human rights records of security forces around the world. While recognizing that every country faces its own unique challenges, we're also committed to ensuring our foreign assistance programs promote the transparent and accountable oversight of security forces, rule of law, and respect for human rights. This is critical for our partners' legitimacy and therefore their effectiveness. One cornerstone principle and process that animates our security assistance is Leahy vetting, which is aimed at ensuring the Departments of State and Defense do not provide any security assistance to actors who've been credibly implicated in gross violations of human rights. And of course, civil society is vital to effective implementation of this policy. We rely on information and advocacy from groups represented here today to aid us in ensuring the veracity and integrity of our Leahy vetting. Ensuring a credible vetting process helps achieve the ultimate objective of implementation of the Leahy Law, the pursuit of accountability for such abuses by our partners. Alongside this critical principle and process, our efforts also include several key actions. We design and deliver programs overseas that promote accountability through internal affairs units and independent oversight bodies. We seek to identify and address how women, racial and ethnic minorities, and LGBTQI+ persons are treated differently within criminal justice systems. We provide training and education that introduces foreign military personnel to key elements of US democracy, such as civilian control of the military, separation of powers, and legislative oversight, and exposes them to universal rights like freedom of expression, freedom of association, and peaceful assembly, and commitment to human rights and international law. We continue to incorporate human rights training into training courses for foreign criminal justice agencies, and we offer specific training to address bias in those systems. We deploy strategic advisors to assist partners to improve security sector governance and institutional capacity, including by promoting civilian oversight and accountability of the defense sector. We engage diplomatically at the United Nations and other fora to ensure global standards and norms reflect best practices in criminal justice. We partner with research and training organizations, as well as federal, state, and local authorities to inject new reform initiatives and best practices into our programming. And we continue to build and strengthen regional networks and norms through programs like the International Law Enforcement Academies, where we're expanding training alumni networks to transform learning and norm setting efforts with single and proceeding from single training events to truly career-long relationships. We continuously review best practices and international standards in our doctrine and how we train foreign units. We also participate in multilateral efforts to improve security sector governance, including NATO's Building Integrity Program, which provides participating NATO allies and partners with tools to combat the risk of corruption and increase transparency, integrity, and accountability in the security and defense sector. But we recognize that security is not only provided by governmental actors. Private security actors are present in many countries. That's why the United States is engaged in promoting norms to guide private security sector actors. We're a founding member of 2 multi-stakeholder initiatives that seek to raise standards in the security sector. The International Code of Conduct Association, which seeks to ensure that providers of security services respect human rights and international humanitarian law, and the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights, an initiative that provides guidance to extractive companies on securing their operations in a manner that respects human rights. Now, we look to you, our civil society organization partners, to lend your expertise on what different implementation approaches and partnerships are most appropriate in different contexts. Civil society organizations, many of whom are attending today, are integral partners who are doing and funding important work in security sector governance. You and other partners already monitor and report on the security sector, especially on alleged violations and accountability or lack thereof. Every day, we rely on that information in our security assistance decisions. We'd like to see an expansion of civil society engaged in this reporting. Many of you and other partners on the ground are doing hands-on work with civilian leaders on reforms and developing expertise on criminal justice and military matters. We hope for an expansion of that expertise so that civil society can increasingly reach out to security first partners with constructive policy proposals and ways to bring these stakeholders together. We must explore how the United States government and international groups can help foster trust and even alliances between local civil society and reformers within the security services. Those reformers exist, but often face marginalization and threats, but with public and political support, they can be crucial in driving the reforms and accountability we seek. Civil society already has unique expertise in one key area, bringing women into peace building and security discussions, recognizing that including women dramatically improves the likelihood of success in peace processes and reduces the recidivism to conflict. Security sector governance needs a whole of society approach. By working together with foreign governments, security forces, and civil society, we can tackle transnational challenges and take greater strides towards global stability. By critically evaluating and improving security sector governance, we can work together to have an enduring impact on all 3 key pillars of the Summit for Democracy: strengthening democracy and countering authoritarianism, addressing and fighting corruption, and promoting respect for human rights at home and abroad. On behalf of the Biden administration, we thank you for your participation today and invite you to contribute, challenge, and critique as we work together to renew democracy in the United States and around the world to meet the unprecedented challenges of our time. Thank you again for the opportunity to address you all today. The United States looks forward to continued engagement with all of you in building a more just, secure, and peaceful world. Thank you.
Thank you, Undersecretary Zeya. And thank you for that framing. As you said, civil society must inform security sector approaches and while also holding governments accountable. I also particularly appreciated your acknowledgement that we have much work to do at home. And now I would like to introduce Ryan Mccannol, the Director of the Center for Conflict and Violence Prevention at USAID. Ryan has been a partner to many of us and is a staunch advocate of USAID staff and grantees in missions across the globe. But first, for those of you who just joined us, you can find the program and the speaker bios in the link that we're dropping in the chat box. Additionally, we have live interpretation accessible in French and Spanish. You can find the interpretation button in the menu at the bottom of your screen with the symbol of the globe. Please choose between English, Spanish, or French to access your preferred language. You can also access closed captioning in the menu by clicking more and choosing your subtitle. By choosing show subtitle. Ryan, all yours.
Thanks. Can I just get a sound check? Give me a thumbs up if you can hear. Okay, great. So hi, everyone. I'm Ryan. I will spare further introduction. I just want to welcome everybody to this virtual plenary panel and to remind you to use the chat function if you have any questions that you'd like to ask the panelists. So I guess the fundamental question that we're looking at today is, what can we do to ensure that security services uphold the law and protect citizens rather than exacerbating or contributing to violence, instability, and abuse? What tools do we have in terms of our diplomacy, development, defense, and law enforcement to train and equip security services with the right mindset and moral outlook, not just the ability to shoot, move, and communicate? And how can we prevent or deter manipulation by powerful political and economic elites? To help answer those questions, USAID has partnered with USIP and established a working group to study the dynamics of elite capture of security sector actors and how it contributes to violence. I'm really thrilled that several of our senior champions and other working group members are participating in the breakout groups that will follow this session. So please stick around and enjoy those discussions. And I'm going to keep our discussion short here in the plenary so that we can get right to those as scheduled. But we do need to hear from you, so I hope that you'll participate in those discussions. Okay, so with that little plug out of the way, let me introduce our panelists. And it's one of the nice things about Zoom is that we actually have panelists that are on 4 different continents. So we have folks from Asia, Europe, and Africa who represent the development, defense, and diplomatic communities. And they're going to help me kick off this discussion. As Kehinde noted, their full bios can be found in the link that Batel shared earlier in the chat box. So our panelists today, we have 3 for this plenary. Adrienne Lemon, who is the head of research for Search for Common Ground. Issouf Traoré, a former member of the Malian Army and a humanitarian liaison to East African militaries. And Mr. Andika Krishna Yudanto, who is the deputy director of the Indonesian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I'm going to start with Adrienne, please. When we spoke yesterday, you mentioned some work that Search for Common Ground has done in the Democratic Republic of Congo to support dialogue between Congolese citizens and security forces. I was hoping you could talk about that program and in particular, highlight the role of gender in your work with those communities.
Sure, thank you, Ryan. It's a pleasure to be here. And yeah, yesterday when we spoke, I was speaking a little bit about our program in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where there have been years and years of efforts around security sector reform. And one of the things that I'll talk a little bit about today, we often focus on sort of the training of military or the systems that exist, the justice system or other systems of governance that might exist that sort of influence the way that military does or does not respect human rights. But one of the key things that we've learned at Search is the community is actually a really core aspect of this, and the way that security services also are related, integrated, or not within communities is a really, really important piece of this puzzle. And when I think, even in my own experience, as Undersecretary Zeya mentioned, that the US is also struggling with this, our image and our understanding of who are those people, who are the police, who are security actors, how am I supposed to engage with them, how should I view them, and what do I expect of them? A lot of that is shaped by things that aren't necessarily only related to those types of trainings that can support an understanding of human rights with security sector actors. So with the community and with that whole group of constituents, there's a question here around what are the mechanisms for taking, integrating or for engaging with security sector? How do we set expectations and accountability to a community without those mechanisms? So one of the key aspects that we've focused on is creating accessible systems. And your question about gender here is really apt, I think, because we see often that women are not as likely to engage in formal systems, or they don't have access the same way that men do to systems like the justice system, for example. And so this actually creates like a major barrier And what we've learned in DRC in that experience was creating things like scorecards, dialogue sessions, even cultural cultural activities like participatory theater sessions, where people were able to sort of express their grievances, express the challenges, and talk about abuse. Those actually kind of turn those dynamics on their head. So we created places where people could come, and it was actually accessible by a very wide range of people. And not only sort of the, I often, when we think about gender access, for example, not all women are the same. And so some women have access to more formal systems and some lack access, either because of literacy or because of certain norms and expectations of just their role, that they're not quite able to engage with more formal systems. So this actually kind of created a leveling and creates space for access and mechanisms for accountability and for people to share and set their own expectations that were not necessarily present or being used in the DRC. Another aspect of this was about enabling better conversations, breaking down some of the barriers to talking about abuse, and also that applies both within communities, but also within security sector actors. So understanding that we needed to sort of break the barriers that often exist between these communities, the way they see themselves as very separate from security actors. And there are a whole host of reasons that can happen, but we've seen this not only in the DRC, but in many places, partially because of the way that security actors move around, partially because of the way that security is often kind of siloed. We don't think of it as a service the way we do other types of work that the government provides. But security is sort of kept over here with its own set of standards and expectations. And so by creating a space where people could talk more openly about what are the kind of driving factors that keep these security actors separated from communities, we could start to unpack what are the common experiences, what are the differences, and how do we also just bring some of the social norms that set that create, or that what's the right word here, that perpetuate violence and the acceptance of violence. How do we start to kind of break those down and provide people the language and the skills to actually meet those head on and talk about them? And then last is really around one of the things that we've used is entertainment. So similarly, the way that I think any of us sort of, a lot of us probably are understanding of who are the police or who our security forces come from, a TV show or something that we've read about in a book that we love. That can also be true for many of these communities. Their understanding of what should they expect, how do they engage, how do we have conversations about trauma that's been experienced or abuse that has happened. All of that is set by a broader understanding of where people fit with their security sector and where that sector is supposed to be accountable to them. And so a lot of the media work that we've done has actually been just to kind of shift the way that people understand what does a police officer offer me? What service do they provide? How do I access that?
Sure.
And so when we talk about, in particular women, and having a reshaping of that under a re-understanding of reshaping their understanding of what's possible, entertainment has been hugely important because you have this space that that can be, quite accessible for a very large group of people, and it's not dependent on any, a social class or a certain type of education or even language. And so that actually provides that.
Audrey, thank you. I'm gonna cut you off only because we only have about 12 minutes left for this particular panel and still two panelists to get to. So Mr. Krishna Yudanto, good to meet you, sir. I wanted to ask you, please, what your perspective is as a diplomat focused on international cooperation and specifically the challenge of violent extremism, how you approach this topic, sir.
Thank you very much, Ryan. I think this is a very important topic. Again, I was serving at the Foreign Ministry, but right now I'm spearheading as Deputy for International Cooperation of the National Counterterrorism Agency of the Republic of Indonesia. So when looking into that, I'm into an agency that looks into more of a security approach sector. Now, looking into that, based on our experience when I was working at the Foreign Ministry, in 2015 came out the Secretaries General call for member states to start embarking on having a national action plan on countering violent extremism. So this is why when I started working here, I tried to promote of having a national action plan. So this national action plan in 2021 was then adopted through a presidential regulation. And this regulation focused on the main elements on what are the drivers of violent extremism. And its part is to promote and increase the protection of the citizens of Indonesia from the threats of violent extremism. So it does look towards more of a soft approach towards looking at the issue of countering terrorism in Indonesia. The work focuses on the prevention pillar, and if you're looking into the activities, there's a lot of activities that are being done through the prevention side of countering terrorism as well as violent extremism. Through this as well, I think one of the good things is that this particular presidential regulation looks into a whole of government and whole of society approach, whereby there is where's that particular link of linking between the works of civil society organizations and the government in actually addressing the drivers of violent extremism. There's a number of factors that are driving this when we're looking into violent extremism in Indonesia, and it's more of a softer approach towards that. What we are also promoting at the regional level since I've taken office in the National Counterterrorism Agency is that we are the ones that initiated the ASEAN Plan of Action to counter the rise of radicalization and violent extremism. This was adopted in 2018, and furthermore, to implement that particular ASEAN Plan of Action, we have a work plan. And this work plan, I think, is it underwent 10 member states looking into it, drafting it. And one of the main elements of that is that when you're looking into ASEAN, for example, it's divided into 3 communities. That is the political security community, then you have the economic community, then you also have the social cultural community. So with having this particular ASEAN Plan of Action, it contributes to a multi-sectoral approach between pillars of sectoral bodies in ASEAN to look into and addressing the issues of violent extremism within ASEAN setting. Of course, this could not have been done with ASEAN without our partnering, for example, with the ASEAN-US Prospect, which is an offshoot of the USAID, and that is to promote cooperation between land linkages between the pillars of the ASEAN community. And I think this is where having a more broad and comprehensive outlook towards violent extremism, looking at it from a softer approaches. One of them, for example, the principles of gender equality, gender mainstreaming is something that is being put inherent within the ASEAN Plan of Action, including the work plan, which is now called the Bali Work Plan that was adopted in 2019. So I think looking into that, those perspectives on human rights, a whole of government, whole of society approach, including women empowerment, gender equality, as well as the empowerment of youth is a contributing factor to the implementation of various work plans within ASEAN setting as well as at the national level. So that I would say those are some of the principles that I believe should be adhered to when implementing approaches in the security sector, looking into, for example, prevention of terrorism as well as violent extremism. Thank you very much, Ryan.
Thank you, sir. And it's an interesting counterpoint to the very sort of grassroots human level that Adrian was talking about, these issues of protocols and multilateral agreements. So, and then to round it out, we actually have Yusuf, who has, among his many other experiences, been a recipient of the Security Force Assistance from the United States as a former officer in the Mali Army. And so, Yusuf, if I could turn it over to you, sir.
Well, thank you, Ryan. Hello, everybody. I am retired Colonel Yusuf Traoré from the Malian Armed Forces. I served more than 20 years in the Malian Army in different command positions, from platoon to regiment to military region commander. I am an alumnus of the Maneuver Captain Career Course in the US, the Joint Special Operation University, and the US Army War College. So like Ryan said, my training in the US was funded through the IMET program, the International Military Education and Training Program. Also, I commanded the Malian 33rd Airborne Regiment, and that regiment was trained and equipped by the US SOF trainers through the Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership. And I'm very honored to talk about some points relating to my journey and to contribute to this panel on security sector assistance. So I will discuss 3 points, one at the tactical, one at the operational, and one at the strategic level. So first, at the tactical level, when these units were trained and equipped by US SOF, they were called special forces, and it was something new in the Malian army. And the term special force was a little bit confusing because the military leadership didn't know how to deal with it and what really entails to be special forces. And the soldiers themselves were a little bit confused because suddenly they were being called special. So some of the young soldiers wanted to act recklessly. They wanted to overreact to show how special they were. And this created a climate that was conducive to, heavy-handed military operation. As an officer in this unit, among the other officers, we had to keep the soldier in check at any given time. We had to exert restraint in all our operation. If we didn't, things could derail quickly. So we really have to exert command and control constantly. And at the operational level, there was a gap between the training of the soldier and the training of the officers. The soldiers were trained to shoot, move, and communicate, and they know how to do it. But as officers, we were not trained to conceptualize the kind of complex operation that will combine conventional forces and non-conventional forces to achieve military objectives. So since the leadership didn't know how to utilize this new capacity, the special forces would be used for anything. It could be escorting VIP, it could be securing the airport during an official visit. It could even be law enforcement operations, which is very dangerous. And so I think the failure to understand the concept, the operational concept behind this new capacity led to the misuse of the new capacity that was created by the Security Corporation. So lastly, at the strategic level, so I received world-class education at the Army War College. So Ryan was one of my professors. I was taught to be a critical thinker, complex problem solver. I had many seminar sessions on civil-military relations. So I read through Huntington and Janodi's theories on civilian control. I read this book, The Soldier and the State. I took an elective on international humanitarian organization, international development with Ryan. And that's when I was introduced to the concept of human security, which is really important. And it helped me a lot during my time as a military region commander in the Mopti region, because I knew the importance of all the partners. Like Search for Common Ground is one of the partners I was working with when I was the military region commander. So I knew that we had soldiers and we had non-military organization, and we were all trying to deliver different effects. So I think that this education really gave me knowledge, strength, and wisdom. And it's important. It's important for a senior officer, especially now in our context in the Sahel, where we have our states are struggling. They are facing violent extremist organizations, and democratically elected officials are struggling to protect the population. So some citizens, out of frustration, out of despair, may call for toppling, democratic regimes. Some people also, out of political calculation, would incite the mass to overthrow the government. But it's really a hard question. And I'm talking as a senior officers, having been in that position. I think that so in history we have some example of exceptional military leader who happen to be great statesmen. So maybe we can look at some cases like George Washington or Napoleon or Atatürk. So I think you have to ask your question, are you on that level? Because if you are not on that level, toppling democratic regime to replace it by a military regime is a slippery slope. So I think, and this is my final thought, you have to be strong, not to be swayed. And then to be strong, you have to be well educated and well mentored. And I am fortunate I was well educated and well mentored. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Yusuf. That's a really great way to end the panel. And unfortunately, we're out of time. I want to say thank you to our panelists and to all of you. We want to make sure that you can go into the breakout session. So please continue the conversation as you go forward. Thanks again. Kehinde, I'm turning it back over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Adrian, Yusuf, and Indika for such a rich discussion. You've given us an excellent background for the rest of today's discussion. We will now move into panel discussions with 3 breakout sessions. But one quick note, you all should feel free to turn your cameras on. We'd be happy to see all of your faces or anyone that wants to show their face. You can find the breakout sessions in your program that Betel will drop the link again. Panel 1 will remain in this Zoom room and will have French and Spanish translation available. Panel 1's topic is preventing elite manipulation and high-level corruption in the security sector. We will have 2 other breakout rooms for panels 2 and 3. Excuse me. Panel 2 will focus on effective civilian and legislative oversight of the security sector. And panel 3 will discuss creating accountable and effective security institutions. My search colleague, Anna Crouch, will magically place our panelists in their breakout rooms, and the rest of you will have the option to choose your breakout room by selecting the room from the pop-up on your screen and by clicking on breakout rooms in your meeting controls. Again, we have dropped the program with descriptions and bios in the chat box. We'll see you all back in 50 minutes. And thank you again to our open plenary speakers.
You said 50 minutes or 15 minutes?
50.
Oh, I am sorry. I think it might then be a little bit late for me, but because I'm going to another meeting or like a cultural event for my embassy, but I will see what I can do.
Thank you for joining us, and we'll take as much time as you give us.
I will try. So that will say 40 Yeah, so yeah, because I will leave at 7:40. Okay, I will see what I can do.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
And it looks like folks are being assigned rooms. Ambassador Taylor, if you want to begin your session while we get folks in and out of rooms.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the folks who are joining us here today. And three of the folks that are joining us are on this panel here. And I am honored to be here with Ambassador Ann Patterson, Rosia San Miguel, and Moses Kisa. We will have the opportunity to talk with all three at some length. But despite what Kenda has said, let me just say that the reason that I'm so pleased to be here with these three is because they're great folks. We'll have great things to say. Ambassador Patterson, of course, was Assistant Secretary of State. She served in Egypt, Pakistan, Colombia, and El Salvador. So she knows about difficult areas. She knows about security sector reform, and Ann is going to have a great set of insights. Rosia San Miguel also brings us a great range of background, experience, Venezuelan lawyer, human rights activist. So just perfect for the kind of things that we're talking about here. Dr. Moses Kisa, again, you can see all the details here, but Assistant Professor of Political Science at the School of Public and International Affairs at Carolina State University. So we're very pleased to have those three join us here today. I'm hoping that members of the audience will be able to join us in questions and comments if we have the time here after we have just a couple of comments and discussions with these three. As both Zeya and Ryan have indicated, this discussion today is on elite capture of security sectors and what the United States can do with our partners, with our host governments, which is the host governments are clearly the most important actors in this. And the question is, what can we do to address this issue? We know that democracy and conflict are related, and this is an important piece of that. Elites use security services for their personal political benefit, and indeed, these are the motivations that we'll want to explore here today. USAID and Institute of Peace have been working on this issue for about a year with the help of Ann Patterson, Don LeBerry, Carl Eikenberry, three ambassadors who have done very good work in this area in particular parts of the world where this is a relevant topic. And, you know, as we say, there are at least three motivations for elite capture. One is to maintain power if they are in government. And we'll hear a little bit about that from our panelists. Second is to mobilize political support, again, inside or outside the government. And the third is to, of course, accumulate wealth. This is always an issue, and it is certainly an issue in the security sector. So I am going to turn to the panelists to give their comments on this thing. And I'd like to first start with Ambassador Ann Patterson. And you've, as I mentioned, served in a lot of places. You can talk about these. The United States has invested a lot of resources and time and energy on security sectors in the countries where you served. How do you think about this? You've been thinking about this with us for a year and have done this most of your life. So what's your sense of the security sector reform and as it relates to elite capture? Ann, over to you.
So thank you very much, Bill. And I very much enjoyed the USIP working group and I've learned a lot. And let me say at the outset that I think the main problems with American security assistance, and that's what I can speak about knowledgeably, is that it doesn't work. And it doesn't work just because it causes abuses, which I think is sort of a side effect, but it doesn't work in many respects because it doesn't develop effective military and police forces, which is what these countries really need. And I want to talk about one issue that I think the United States could do vastly better than it does now that would make a huge difference, and that's transparency. And one reason that elite capture works so well in countries like Egypt is that nobody else except a few elites understand anything about the programs. And the United States has aggravated this tendency for years. I know there have been changes in recent years with the Global Fragility Act, with the Transparency Act in 2016, and I think some of our civilian agencies have done a good job. But still, it is almost impossible to tell without research assistance and a huge amount of work what these security programs really consist of. Who is the aid being provided to? How much does it cost? Who is implementing it? What contractors are being used, and in the local language? So people like NGOs and the press and political parties, and I would even say competing elites. Because, for instance, one of the issues in Egypt was that there was certainly elite capture that was used to essentially produce revenue. Well, what if you're sitting out in the Sinai and you need some of those resources to support your units? If you were a military leader, maybe you'd like to know that sort of thing. So there are lots of implications, I think, with the complexity of our program, and this is a problem that we can solve. If you go look at some of the programs on the US government things, you'll see a huge number of redactions in the security area on the grounds that these are exceptions to the Transparency Act. I would argue that's nonsense. None of this stuff is classified, and it would help the whole issue of elite capture, the possibility of elite capture, enormously if we could simply tell the public in these countries what we're funding. So I'll stop there and we can come back. Thank you.
And excellent point. We will come back to this issue of transparency. A key component of any reform, whether it's in the United States or overseas, this is going to be probably a theme throughout this day and probably throughout this week. I mean, we got this whole democracy summit, which will focus on this. Rocio, let me ask you to elaborate a little bit on your experiences in Venezuela or others, but the Venezuelan example, the Venezuelan case is a particularly interesting one right now, but is a particularly complicated one in terms of elite capture, which I'm sure you can describe very well. So, Rocio, please, over to you.
Sí, muchísimas gracias. Una enorme oportunidad para nosotros compartir con ustedes, expertos en materia de seguridad y defensa, a la vez que compartir la visión que desde Venezuela tenemos sobre los desafíos en torno a los problemas de seguridad y defensa. Al frente de la organización Control Ciudadano, que es un observatorio de seguridad y de Fuerzas Armadas en Venezuela, hemos hecho durante estos últimos 16 años una incidencia permanente en 5 principios claves que consideramos son los pilares de este sector. La democracia, el respeto a los derechos humanos, la transparencia, el derecho de la participación y, por supuesto, el respeto al Estado de Derecho. Estamos convencidos, a pesar de lo que eso significa en Venezuela, en términos incluso de criminalización de la actividad que realizamos las ONGs, de la importancia de la transparencia y la auditabilidad de presupuestos, no solo de seguridad, sino también de defensa, pensando que estos dos sectores en nuestros países están tan relacionados, pero confrontándolos con conceptos de eficacia y logros y, por supuesto, de derechos humanos. Creemos que no solo se trata de principios, necesitamos en nuestros países comisiones de seguridad en los congresos fuertes, necesitamos jueces especializados en el sector de seguridad, necesitamos ONG especializadas como observatorios de seguridad, igualmente que los periodistas. Es decir, no basta con los principios, sino también con un capital humano formado en diferentes sectores en materia de seguridad y defensa. Pero también es necesario formar líderes políticos para que sean capaces de innovar en propuestas de seguridad y defensa. En este momento en Venezuela hay muchas críticas sobre la militarización del poder, sobre la partidización de la Fuerza Armada Nacional, pero hay muy pocas propuestas robustas sobre cómo afrontar los desafíos del sector para el momento que sea posible restablecer la democracia en Venezuela. Todos sabemos que es necesario la vigilancia permanente del respeto de los derechos humanos, pero yo quisiera permitirme recordar en este panel la importancia de promover el respeto de otras dos ramas de derecho internacional que protege a la persona humana, y es el derecho internacional de los refugiados y el derecho internacional humanitario. Son dos ramas que impactan definitivamente sobre el sector de la seguridad. Y en el caso venezolano, la protección de los refugiados es un signo de especial importancia en materia de seguridad, dado la crisis humanitaria compleja que existe en nuestro país, que ha significado en este momento la migración forzada de más de 6 millones de venezolanos en el mundo, 2 millones de los cuales en este momento se encuentran en un país fronterizo como Colombia. Por supuesto, hacer hincapié en las reglas básicas del sector, la profesionalización de los efectivos militares y de los efectivos policiales, y siempre tener permanente la contribución de la cooperación internacional en este sentido, promoviendo la realización de ejercicios combinados y de todo tipo de ayuda que pueda ser posible en este sentido. Creo, y esto es muy polémico, pero estamos convencidos que es importante una mayor participación de los estados en la Convención Internacional que prohíbe el reclutamiento, la utilización, el financiamiento y entrenamiento de mercenarios. Repito, un tema polémico en muchos países, pero que estamos positivos pueden redundar en materia de seguridad. Creemos que hay que subir un escalón en la formación permanente operativa de los funcionarios de seguridad y efectivos militares, cómo elaborar reglas de enfrentamiento, cómo establecer procedimientos, pasar de la enseñanza declarativa a una enseñanza práctica que permita efectivamente hacer realidad las leyes, los manuales de procedimiento. Creo que, y esto es muy importante y se suele olvidar, necesario establecer mecanismos de control democrático sobre los cuerpos y sistemas de inteligencia, así como prohibir el establecimiento de centros de detención por parte de órganos de inteligencia. En Venezuela, la mayor cantidad de atrocidades documentadas por la Misión Internacional de Determinación de los Hechos tiene como perpetradores funcionarios de los dos más importantes servicios de inteligencia en el país. Ya acercándome al final y pensando un poco en los desafíos que plantean los temas de seguridad para las élites, es necesario edificar rutas de justicia transicional, depositar exclusivamente la esperanza de justicia en las cortes penales ad hoc internacionales o en la Corte Penal Internacional es una visión muy limitada de la justicia, porque la justicia tiene que ser retributiva y tiene que ser también restaurativa, porque además de las penas, sin verdad, sin reconciliación, no es posible superarse los problemas de violencia y de conflicto que existen en nuestros países. Finalmente, creemos que los desafíos más importantes del siglo XXI a nivel global van a ser las tensiones que existen entre la necesidad de seguridad y el respeto a los derechos humanos. Hay mucho que trabajar y pensar para minimizar estas tensiones en beneficio de los derechos humanos. Con esto cierro y por supuesto atenta a las preguntas específicas que pudieran existir del resto de los participantes. Muchísimas gracias.
Rosia, thank you very much. Very interesting insights. I note some common themes that overlap with Ambassador Patterson, with Ann's comments. In particular, one of your five is transparency, which Ann highlighted. But also, you both talked about the importance of military and police training. So I think we undoubtedly will come back to that one as well. Dr. Kisa, I would be very pleased if you would give us your comments, in particular on Uganda, but other places as well. You've got a great background that we would love to hear about, and over to you, sir.
Thank you, Ambassador Taylor. I hope everybody can hear me well. And Ambassador Taylor, it's my understanding that I'll speak for about 5 minutes, right? Yeah, okay, very good. Well, okay, thank you very much for organizing this and for inviting me. Very glad to be participating. And thanks a lot to my USIP colleagues who I see are on the call as well, Kerlin and Alex, with whom we've been working and, from whom I've been learning a lot, even as I sort of, provide my own, intellectual input towards this discussion. So this is an incredibly important subject, understanding the place of the armed forces and the military in African states. Most African states still face enormous challenges in terms of marshalling, competent and capable national armed forces. And so the question of the military and the use of force remains central and critical. And it's a double-edged challenge because on the one hand, African militaries still face challenges of effectiveness, of being capable and able to do what armed forces are supposed to do, which is provide security in the traditional sense, but also more broadly human security and stabilization of otherwise fragile nations. But secondly, of course, the armed forces have to be accountable. They have to be, subject to the oversight and control of, not just civilian authorities, but also the public, society. Armed forces have to be accountable to the society that they serve. And so here is where the challenge is. And so if you look at a country like Uganda, which is, my home country, it's faced this problem for a long time, reconciling between having an efficient and capable armed forces on the one hand, but making that armed forces accountable and in the service of the people, not of elites and regimes. So Uganda is incredibly important in this discussion because it's been a key actor in the Great Lakes region and has been a partner of the United States for a long time in a wide range of areas, but particularly in the security realm. The Great Lakes region, as many of you folks may know, is unstable from all sorts of directions. The Congo has been a problem for a long time, South Sudan, there have been issues in Burundi, of course, Rwanda had big problems in the 90s. And so Uganda sitting sort of at the center of it all has been a critical actor that Western powers like the US have looked to in terms of dealing with the issues in the region. But secondly, Uganda has had its own share of domestic security issues, particularly terrorism. As you may know, just last month, there was a string of bomb attacks and terrorist activities in the capital, Kampala, and around the capital. And that has now set off a campaign of the Ugandan armed forces into the DR Congo to go after the Allied Democratic Forces that are now an affiliate of previously of Al-Qaeda and now of ISIS. But the third point is that Uganda has been involved in peacekeeping, particularly in Somalia, where the United States has maintained a long-standing national security interest. And so the Ugandan troops have been the most important actors in trying to stabilize Somalia that has been without a functional and competent government for pretty much 30 years now. So sort of, within that broader context of the issues, Uganda's security sector has been a subject of elite manipulation in a variety of ways. And I think the overarching goal and agenda of the manipulative practices of the Ugandan elites comes down to regime survival. So, we have a government that has been in power for 35 years. And the president who has been in power for 36 years now. And at the end of the day, when shove comes to push, President Museveni's most important goal is to stay in power. Everything else is secondary. The primary consideration and the primary role of the armed forces is to secure him in power. And so to do that, him and his government and other elites around have engaged in different manipulative practices, including, and I'm just going to mention a couple, and then I'll end there, Ambassador Taylor. One, fragmentation of the armed forces. So there is an incredible, landscape of parallel and competing security and military agencies in Uganda. Including, creating special forces that is outside of the legal framework for the military, So the Special Forces Command, SFC, which, pretty much has become a personal protection wing of the military for the president, right? And there are other sort of, fragmentary agencies that you see all over the place, and that creates a lot of problems for managing the armed forces in the country. And then secondly, there is militarization of otherwise civilian institutions, including law and order agencies like the police. The military in Uganda has such a preponderant role that it's everywhere, including in police where it shouldn't be. And then third and sort of last is the manipulation of the budgeting process to use especially classified expenditure for all sorts of ends, including, of course, political operations, particularly during elections. So these different ways of manipulating the armed forces have a range of implications. But I think the most important is that the human rights situation in Uganda has been worsening over time, partly, and I think in large measure, because of the way the armed forces have been manipulated and used for political ends, primarily for the incumbents, regime survival and regime endurance purposes. And just as one last point, which sort of re-echoes what previous speakers have pointed out, is generally there is almost no oversight, when it comes to the armed forces in Uganda. President Museveni and the commanders in the military pretty much do what they want, including deploying Ugandan troops, abroad without any parliamentary approval or parliamentary oversight. And the decision-making on issues to do with the military are pretty much the personal business of the president. And of course, the United States has been complicit in some ways in enabling this because, it's worked with Museveni and provided all the security assistance without ensuring that there is transparency and accountability of the armed forces. I went over by a couple of minutes, Ambassador Taylor, but I will pause it there for now. Thank you very much for your kind audience.
Moses, very fine job. Very nice job. Let me do one thing before I go back to Ambassador Patterson for a question about one of the things she raised about, you just talked about, Moses, too, which was the transparency, the classification of budgets, these kind of things. It's a very interesting point. But as we prepare for the comments, questions from the audience. We got a great group. And by the way, Moses, thank you for recognizing Colin and Alex and Philippe and this group that has really done great work on this task force, on this working group that we've been doing. And I see we have people like Ambassador Carson on here. So this is a great group. So those of you who have questions, you can either put them in the chat, as they've said, and I'll try to keep my eye on that. Or you can raise your hand. Now, my problem is I see that we've got like 3 screens worth of people on this thing, so I may miss some of these hands raised, but I will do my best. And I see Johnny Carson's face, Ambassador Carson's face on here, so I know that he can. Great to have you here, Ambassador Carson. So,
and Ambassador Taylor, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, please.
My colleague Beitel Hailu is here. I will actually help moderate both the chat questions and the raise hand function. So all you have to do is—
That would be extremely useful.
Yes.
Thank you. And thank you to both of you. That would be great. So you've got options on how to ask questions. While you're doing that, Ann, you raised the tension, the possibility within a government, let's say the United States government, that will come up when trying to address this issue of elite capture or try to assess the problems associated with security sector reform. Because, as you know well, there are other imperatives that the U.S. government has. It's not just reform. I mean, there are other things that we try to do. Can you address that along with the transparency question and classification of budgets? Maybe it's the same issue, but if I can ask you to elaborate that a little bit more based on what both Moses and Rocio said.
Yeah, I think both Mr. Kisa and Mr. Traore raised one of these conundrums that the U.S. government have, and let me just elaborate on that. And that's the training of these special forces units. And I would highlight that as consistently a problem. It was a problem in Afghanistan. It was a problem in Iraq. It was a problem all over Latin America. And here's why we do it. Because they're good, generally speaking. They're competent forces. We know how to do it. And all the counterterrorism operations in recent years pushed us in that direction to have these specialized counterterrorism forces. But it had a number of the problems which our previous speakers have outlined. It's the sort of issue that U.S. government people on the ground have to reconcile and work with. The other problem with that was there was no institution, as our speakers have pointed out, for these special units to nest in. In other words, they couldn't, if they weren't part of a broader and more productive and effective force, they too would eventually fail and go awry, which is what happened in other countries. So that's a good example, I think, of how the U.S. government, both legislation and policy, is pushed. And on the transparency in budgets, I would say the first thing, yes, we've pushed budgets overseas, transparent budget, but let's get our own house in order first on this transparency stuff and then talk to the recipients. And when we can have a 1 or 2 page explanation of what our security assistance is in plain English on the web to Egypt or Jordan or any number of countries, then we can talk about pushing transparency on other countries. It's hugely important, but we need to start with ourselves.
And excellent point. As I was scanning the other 3 screens, I see we have Ambassador Moose has joined us as well, who has some expertise in this area. I know, Moses, you've got some reactions there. Let me. I see George Moose has something in the chat. Very much, Moses. Appreciate your candid comments, including your observation how the U.S. government has been complicit in promoting Uganda military in ways that have inadvertently legitimized its role in Uganda. And Ambassador Moose, if you've got anything more you wanted to elaborate here, I will then ask Dr. Kisa Moses to respond. But George, anything else? Very good. Okay, Moses, your thoughts.
Oh no, I couldn't agree more. So and as I said in my earlier remarks, I think it's for the United States it's a conundrum because on the one hand, I think the Ugandan military has done very well in many respects as a fairly decent and professional armed forces that has played an important role in stabilizing the region and in peacekeeping in Somalia. The Ugandan military generally in Somalia has been a success. But then on the other hand, the military in Uganda has also been used for very personal and narrow regime, ends. And so there is sort of a contradictory, dynamic at play there. And what does the US do to that? On the one hand, I think the US has, focused on trying to deal with, counterterrorism and, and tackling, regional security problems in the Great Lakes region and the Horn of Africa. But inadvertently, that, US support has also helped to prop up, malign activities and elite, interests, including, using the military in Uganda for ends that, not in either national or regional security interest. And I think that remains a problem. In my own sense, now speaking as a Ugandan, I think that matters have been going in such a bad direction that, things increasingly look very, very bad for my country. And because Museveni is he's trapped in power, and because his background is a military background, Museveni, is at a very core level, he is a specialist in violence. That is his original, sort of orientation and training, which is he was a guerrilla man, right? And fought an armed rebellion to capture power. You see, in his life, he's never been anything else other than, presiding over the use of violence. And so because of that background, his stay in power, the longer he has stayed in power, the more he cannot see himself doing anything else other than remaining in power. And for him to continue being in power, he has to resort to the core institution that is under his control, but one which he also understands very well, which is the military. And so he has to use the military in all sorts of ways, and therefore inevitably you get the kind of worsening human rights situation as has been happening in Uganda in recent years, with the militarization of the police, because Museveni does not see the police as a civil law and order institution. He sees the police as a coercive instrument that has to serve his regime survival interests. And so he's been appointing, army officers, senior army officers to command the police. The police pretty much in Uganda today is under the capture and control of the military.
Moses, thank you. Thank you very much. And I also see that Michael Phelan he first puts out excellent comments on the complex cooperation associated with Uganda, but he also has a suggestion. And Michael, I'm going to ask you to speak here. I'm sure they'll let you unmute. But you put in the chat, trade-offs must be considered and alternative policy choices regularly discussed. As years pass, the imperative to shift should be paramount relative to impact of status quo policies. That's what we're about here, looking for alternatives. I mean, there may be some good alternatives, maybe bad, but we're looking for alternative options on ways to make the things work better. And Michael, it sounds like you've got some ideas, and I'd love for you to go ahead and present those. And then, Rocio, I'm going to come to you about the question of outside influence in Venezuela that may affect the security sector. But Michael, if you're still on, if you can unmute and elaborate on these alternative policy choices.
Certainly. Thank you, Bill. This is a wonderful discussion and one well worth having now and going forward. My point is that certainly the trade-offs and the rationalization for the security cooperation that the United States has or any country has with other countries in varying states of governance must meet certain expectations, both in the moment, but on an ongoing basis and a continuing basis. And that must redound to the benefit of both the donor country, of course, but more specifically to the general long-term health and benefit of the partner country. And one needs to take a step back and reconsider the rationalization for such cooperation and the level. And these discussions should be open and very public, such that the partner country and the government recipient of these assistance resources understands that there is a competition for this resource. It is not an unlimited resource, and that there is a greater good to be pursued rather than near-term or expedient outcomes. But the discussion needs to be there, and both the public and the partner country need to hear that that discussion is ongoing and that it isn't as guaranteed as it might be perceived. Thank you, Bill.
Michael, thank you. Great point. Ambassador Caution has a note in here, which I'm going to come back to, Johnny. But let me first bring Rocio San Miguel back into the conversation here, because we've talked about how it's important for internally to make some changes, and we've talked. Ann Patterson has emphasized the importance of U.S. making changes and cleaning our own houses and our own stables and this kind of thing. But Rocio, in Venezuela, there are other actors yet. That is, and I'm thinking of the Chinese and maybe the Russians, who are playing a role in Venezuela, not always constructive. And I'd be interested in your thoughts about outside interference in the security sector and indeed how it affects elite manipulation. Rocio, over to you.
Sí, cómo no. Venezuela es claramente un país en este momento que está siendo utilizado para instalar esas viejas tensiones este-oeste entre los bloques de poder mundial con pocas ganancias para los venezolanos. Eso tiene que decirse de manera enfática. Hay, por supuesto, un impacto geopolítico y regional muy importante de la crisis venezolana. Muy pocas personas se dan cuenta que Venezuela es un país que tiene límites internacionales con 14 países. Es decir, solemos pensar en Venezuela al norte de Sudamérica, limitando solamente con Colombia o con Brasil, pero tenemos un amplio anillo fronterizo que nos coloca en límites internacionales con 14 estados y la verdad es que en este momento no tenemos ni un solo acuerdo vigente de seguridad con ninguno de esos 14 países. Es más, no hay posibilidad de tránsito por mucho tiempo, producto de la pandemia, a través de estas fronteras y no tenemos vuelos directos con ninguno de todos estos países. En la práctica, Venezuela se ha convertido en una isla y es una circunstancia que sin duda favorece el control del poder. El discurso nacionalista ha sido instrumentado en Venezuela en estos últimos 20 años y forma un símbolo de identidad naturalmente militar en todas las Fuerzas Armadas. Y creo que hay que tener mucho cuidado o tomar en cuenta la importancia de los conceptos del nacionalismo, de la integridad territorial y de la soberanía para poner sobre la mesa propuestas sobre Venezuela. No siempre será bien recibido por las Fuerzas Armadas, pero tampoco por los ciudadanos que aspiramos a la democracia en el país. Propuestas de intervención militar extranjera, propuestas de golpes de Estado, propuestas que circulan con mucha facilidad sobre el tema Venezuela a nivel internacional, como tampoco este tipo de propuestas a veces vacías de lo que ha sido internacionalmente llamado el deber de proteger. Con esto solamente quiero dirigirme a tratar de aterrizar en los elementos constructivos que la comunidad internacional puede poner sobre los conflictos de los países. tratando de limpiar un poco la polarización este-oeste o la polarización democracias versus a otras culturas. Pensemos por un momento en el día cero en Venezuela en que sea posible restablecer la democracia. Vamos a tirar a la basura las compras militares que se han hecho a Rusia, a China, a Bielorrusia y al resto de los llamados aliados estratégicos. Por supuesto que no. Al decir que vamos a cortar todo vínculo de mantenimiento, por ejemplo, de esos sistemas de armas, estamos ofendiendo a la Fuerza Armada Nacional, que tiene una fuente de orgullo natural en la capacidad operativa de sus sistemas de armas. Con esto quiero poner un ejemplo bastante simbólico de los cuidados que tenemos que tener para abordar las muy complejas situaciones de países donde las disputas internacionales se hacen parte como elemento sustantivo y no precisamente para solventar los problemas internos. Lamentablemente hay graves problemas en Venezuela de operatividad a pesar de las compras militares, hay completa opacidad en los acuerdos suscritos con los nuevos socios estratégicos, tanto con China como con Rusia, Bielorrusia, Irak y otros países. Y esto tiene que superarse, pero sin distingo de la cooperación militar de la que se trate. Aún en el futuro, cooperando con los Estados Unidos, esta cooperación tiene que ser transparente, tiene que ser auditable y se tienen que rendir cuentas. Es el problema que debemos superar los venezolanos a partir del momento que sea posible el restablecimiento de la democracia. Superar esos clichés de unos contra otros y entender los matices que son importantes para construir un sendero posible de fortalecimiento de la democracia y de atención a los problemas de integridad, de soberanía, pero a los enormes desafíos, sin duda, de seguridad que plantea el país. Muchísimas gracias.
Rosia, thank you very much. Very good point. You brought in the effect of outside powers and how difficult it will be to address that. Speaking of difficulty, I see that Ambassador Carson points out we need to know when to pull back from relations that go wrong. Also hard, as you say, Rosia. It will have that effect. Ambassador Patterson in the chat also points out that the review process of security assistance is pro forma. This is because the programs are complex. You will see in the USIP case study, and I'm going to come back to that in my closing remarks. In fact, I'm going to wrap this up here shortly. That's why I'm going to the chat questions here and acknowledging Ola, who gave us a good point about, remember, this has to do with humanitarian aid as well. Transparency is important as well. So let me just say that as Ann Patterson has mentioned, there are several case studies that Alex Berg is editing right now and is working very hard with colleagues on here. We will have that study for USAID. USIP is working on a study for USAID and will be available to all the participants in this as well. So let me thank my colleagues, Ambassador Patterson, Moses Kisa, and Rosia San Miguel for very good insights. Let me thank the people who put in questions on the chat and generated the conversation in the chat as well. And with that, let me turn this back over to whoever's going to be in charge of this. And this may be back to you.
Thank you, Ambassador Taylor. You guys actually have about 3 more minutes before we go back to the full session. So if you have any more chatter, you're welcome to do it. We're going to open the rooms in 3 minutes.
Very good. Then let me ask Johnny Carson, Ambassador Carson, if Johnny, you talked about a hard thing to do, and that is pull back when relations are not going well. You got something specific in mind in that, or what proposals do you have?
Bill, thanks, and Moses Keese has done an excellent job. Yes, I think there should be some kind of a strategic review of the policy at critical points in our relationships. And Uganda is a particular point. Many people forget what President Museveni inherited when he came into power in 1986. His government replaced one of Africa's worst and brutal dictators, Idi Amin, who had been in power for approximately 8 years and had expelled some 70,000 Asians and had killed off the Black political and educated and judicial elite in the country. And so his coming into power represented a significant change. He also came into power doing things which were very welcomed by the international community. He was the first African president to recognize that HIV/AIDS was a problem, and he invited the health community, and he adopted the World Bank and IMF economic reforms when other African leaders were pushing back against him. He engaged in the efforts of DDR with the World Bank and had some of the most successful reintegration programs. And he uncharacteristically invited Asians to come back, and those who did not come back, he said, we will give you the value for your property. All of those things were represented a different leadership. And he also professed to be moving towards a more democratic agenda. About 10 years into that regime, things changed, really started to change. And Moses is absolutely right. He has become one of Africa's most authoritarian leaders and continues to drift away from the democratic orbit into an increasingly big man style of politics and using the military to secure his power and doing things that ingratiate the West in a different kind of way, externally, but not internally. The question is how do we change course once someone has started to drift away from the values and principles that we live by? He has done that, and he is doing it consistently. But at some point along that scale, we should have been able to say, enough is enough. We're going to break these relationships. We have to change them. And there is a need for a strategic review in our relationships with countries that are developing to make sure that we don't drift into an automatic pattern of continued support for leaders who are not doing right.
Johnny, thank you. Well said. Moses, thanks for your points on that. And I see Ann Patterson has another point in the chat, but now we are out of time. So Kehinde, I'm going to turn it back to you. Thank you again for all the participation. We'll talk soon.
Thank you, Ambassador Taylor. Thank you, Melanie and Dixon, for moderating your sessions as well. I will now turn it over to Dr. Sani at USIP to moderate the closing.
Thank you, Kehinde. Just a mic check. I hope everyone can hear me well. Perfect. Thanks. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon for those who are joining us from Africa or Asia. My name is Joseph Sani. I'm the Vice President, the head of the Africa Center at the United States Institute of Peace. Welcome to this closing plenary of a series of panels on supporting democratic approaches to security governance. Since this morning, several experts have explored different aspects and layers of supporting and promoting accountability, respect of human rights, and effectiveness to security assistance. Now, to bring all these ideas together, and then not an easy task, we will admit, but we are fortunate to be joined by two experienced and distinguished senior policymakers. Mrs. Chidi Blyden, she's U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for African Affairs, and Ambassador Margaret Schumann, Director of Stabilization and Humanitarian Assistance at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I will not go through the long and excessive bios. You will have them on the program, and then I believe the link is on the chat. We only have 30 minutes to cover this and bring all these ideas home. So I will go, let's start right away. I will start by looking at the effectiveness of security assistance. We have been talking about security assistance, but does it work? And if it does, for who, right? We see since 2020, we are witnessing what the UN Secretary General has called an epidemic of coup d'etat, particularly in Africa, the cases of Mali, Sudan, Guinea, where tensions between civilian government and the military have highlighted the increasing role of security actors in politics and the economy as well. In addition, we have seen acts of terrorism, violence, extremism, and human rights abuses in the Sahel and different parts of the world. Many of these countries have benefited and continue to benefit from security assistance from the US and the EU. So my first question really to Das Biden, are these coups a statement of failure of security assistance or a clear indication of its ineffectiveness? Or we are in a situation where the medicine may do more harm than good? I know it's a tough one, but Das Biden, please take us on, please.
Well, Dr. Sani, thank you very much for having me at this closing plenary, and thank you very much for allowing me to actually sit in SIP spaces to address this forum. It is a pleasure to be here today and to just share a few thoughts about the role of the security sector and what the security sector means in larger democracy and governance conversations. I think to your specific question, are these coups a statement of failure of security assistance? I think we need to think a little bit more broadly than that. I think the political transitions we're seeing represent an interesting change in civic dynamics across the world. And I think citizens in various countries are expressing their desire for change and are taking active roles in bettering their security situations on the ground. I think rather than maybe looking at it one way or viewing these transitions as a failure of just the inject of security assistance, I'd like to try and get a better understanding of the root causes and the drivers of some of these transitions. But specifically on coups, I couldn't sit here from the agency that I sit from, the Department of Defense, without having a thought on this. And I think that coups are in part a result of ineffective defense and security enterprises. While we continue to improve the effectiveness of security assistance, I think we need to think through whether our approach is appropriately balanced and implemented to strengthen the professionalism of armed forces and police and their respect for civilian authority and human rights. I want to maybe just make a quick note about how we view security assistance. Security assistance can be seen as one of two things: the provision of military equipment or programs that influence the behaviors of security forces. And the behaviors includes the professionalism, the respect for civilian authority, and human rights, as noted above, but also the effectiveness of the institutions that govern defense and security establishments. I think this is why engagement is so key to the constant reinforcement and exchange of practices between partners. And it's critical to ensuring that these values are enduring and are culturally contextual. So while I think that we're seeing a trend, I don't know if that trend, to maybe Ambassador Carson's point, is not a natural part of the security sector reform process.
Thanks, Ms. President. I just came back from Niger, the Sahel, and one thing that's not also common and a trend there, and I think in this conversation about security sector reform, is the inclusion of women. I think, and when we ask the question, does it work and for who? I think the issue of women comes up clearly. And I know, Ambassador Sherman, you have been the champion of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security agenda. I was just wondering, how have our European colleagues approached this issue of women inclusion? And how do you operationalize the participation of women into the security sector?
Thank you for that question. I think maybe to build on what the Deputy Assistant Secretary just said, we have to look at a broader perspective of a larger effort, which ultimately is supposed to address root causes of conflict instability instead of symptoms, and which is supposed to deliver lasting peace. And lasting peace can only be lasting and sustainable when it's inclusive. And I think that has always been for me the core of resolution UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, the mother of resolution, I would say, from 2000, that historic lesson that there can be no lasting peace without inclusion. So I think it starts with agreeing on the goal, on the hard lesson of history, learned in history, and then maybe to, as you said, the basics. So it's a strategic need. Let's say that it's not a nice to have; it's a must have. It's a fundamental issue to foster equal participation. And I think there's to operationalize it, maybe very briefly, I think 2 entry points where we have to do better on this promise of inclusive and hence lasting peace and security, and that's the start point and the end point. The start is when we try to get to inclusive peace and security is starting with asking the right questions to the right people. Shut up and listen. Shut up is the difficult part, and listen. Because also, as I said, the inconvenient truth is if we ask the men, women, boys and girls we're supposed to protect and we're supposed to serve, what their security concerns are and what their ambitions are, they may not always give the politically right answer, and they may ask for things we're not entitled or we're not in our mandate to provide, but we have to link to others to do those. Sometimes very practical things like providing electricity so that women can actually have time to sit at the table and contribute rather than cooking and washing and do all the other stuff. So the starting point is asking the right questions, shut up and listen, I would say, and recognizing that women have agency in their own right, and that their ambitions, their asks and their grievances are just as valuable as those of the other half of the population. And the same goes for youth and other marginalized groups. And the second is the end point, and that is to have a long-term perspective and long-term investment in local resilience and agencies of the men, women, boys and girls affected by conflict and instability. So we have to be a lot more serious about the sustainability of our interventions, any security sector intervention, and about fostering local resilience. As I said, sustainable peace needs inclusion of those we're mandated to correct, but it also needs long-term engagement.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I can see Das Bryden jumping because I'm sure you have a lot to say on that. But I know you will get to that question as well, Das Bryden. But Ambassador Schumann, you mentioned 2 things. I think local resilience and local voices, and shut up and listen to those local voices. And as I know, Das Bryden, you will come back to the issue of women. I wanted to ask, how do you then reconcile the local security needs, so local voices, with defense priorities that are driving most of the security assistance, right? So Das Bryden, maybe, I'm sure as you will jump on the issue of women, but you can also help us understand how the Department of Defense reconcile the defense priorities with the local voices, the local security concerns.
I think Ambassador Sherman gave me a really good opening in using a word that is now the word du jour, but it means a lot in the sense of inclusiveness. And I think one of the biggest issues that I face on a regular basis is making sure that there is enough of that inclusive voice from a cultural and context when dealing with policy decisions and engaging partners to come up with solutions that are welcome in their sphere. I think Dr. Sani, you've heard me say in the past that African security challenges are not the same as US defense priorities or other international defense priorities. But if you address the African security challenges, that is those things that are important to Africans. Those are everyday challenges that every other country faces, the pandemics, the health insecurity, food insecurity, gender and women and children issues. You will get at the defense priorities or strategic objectives of any other country because you have now gotten a partner that is mutually working with you on a number of different issues. I think given the agency I represent, I don't think it would surprise anyone here that I believe that the security sector must be part of the solution. And that means being inclusive of or being included in the conversation from the very beginning. I think with this in mind, I'd like to just frame the cultural context and inclusiveness in 3 myths about the security sector. Myth number 1, the security sector is narrowly defined to mean just defense and military. And I think in reality, the security sector is actually a compilation of a myriad of facets, which I just alluded to, which include communications, cyber, energy, food, agriculture, healthcare, emergency services, and on. Yes, defense and military plays a role in the security sector, but it's one of many critical facets which must align and integrate and complement each other. Again, inclusive. Myth number 2, that security is maybe not a part of governance. I think actually governance, as defined by Merriam-Webster, is the act or process of governing or overseeing the control and direction of something, such as a country or an organization. And many of our interagency colleagues routinely refer to 3 pillars that are necessary for a nation to succeed within the security sector realm or with security institutions. And these 3 pillars are security, prosperity, and good governance. I think in the cultural context, again, we must be working collectively to complement one another for the nation to succeed. And that some of those themes have already been sort of presented here from the snippets I heard from the conversation earlier. I think the last myth that, again, maybe goes to the role of the security sector is that it is only a tool of the government, and therefore it is only to be used to manipulate an outcome. And I think, unfortunately, we've often seen too much reporting and images of military and police forces deployed, and what sometimes either is perceived to be or actually is a manner not conducive to upholding good governance. And that said, I think that when security sectors and the security sector reform process is employed correctly, you'll see defense and law enforcement forces as a part of the solution. But again, they have to be sort of included in that conversation from the get-go. And I think this is similar to the conversations that we have with making sure that the cultural context is appropriate in the security sector reform process, as well as how we employ the security sector to address the needs, governance needs of citizens across the world.
And I think what I'm hearing, and we have heard it throughout this morning, is a really multi-stakeholder and holistic approach to security. It's not just a military approach. You have to involve all stakeholders, including women, including even the private sector, I will argue. But at the same time, you also have to include the elite. And one of the breakout sessions today was, how do we prevent elite manipulation and high-level corruption in the security sector? And elite is not just the security sector elite, I mean, the elite in the society. So in some of the most poorly governed contexts, and you mentioned governance, abuses by a range of security services are often rooted in elite manipulation for personal or political gain to amass power and wealth. And some of these are driving some of the coup d'etat we see in the continent. So my question to Ambassador Schumer, how do you, in the case of the Dutch government, how do you assess the problem of elite capture and this necessity to have a holistic approach to security sector governance?
It is, I think, a very pertinent question, because obviously elite capture is maybe what bothers us most, so to say. I think it's critical, therefore, to have this larger approach, that security assistance is just one of the instruments we can have as part of a focus on security sector governance. And that is part of a larger sustainable development strategy. I think to a certain extent, elite capture is not something unique for the security sector. Coming more from a development background, one of my first lessons more than 20 years ago in in Zambia, where I was supporting, as a very junior officer, advising on security sector reform and public finance management. One of my lessons from a very wise Zambian minister was, you can't ask the fish to empty the pond. I think it just underlines the phrase that we have to understand the context in which we work. We have to understand and do a collective political economy analysis in order to identify those actors, agents of change that can foster that political will, because we from the outside will never do that. And at the same time, working at creating local demand for better service, for better security provision, like we do in any other sector. So again, it starts with analysis of the powers that be, the dynamics, analysis of what the security needs and concerns are of the people we're supposed to protect, and before we decide on what the interventions and the tools are we may use.
Thanks. I like that. We can't ask the fish to empty the pond, right? Somebody has to do it. And that's
a Zambian saying.
I will remember that. And therefore, someone has to empty the pond, or at least oversee the pond to see if the pond is clean, right?
Exactly.
And so that brings me to the issue of security sector oversight and the role of maybe civil society or citizen, because beyond training and equipping the military personnel and making sure that the pond works well, how can we strengthen the capacity for civilian oversight to security sector assistance? What are the best practices? Das Bryden, I will give it to you generously.
Well, I think that's a question I think that we're all here trying to answer today is, what are the actual tools that help to strengthen that oversight? And I think, the very things that we're discussing today, advancing democratic principles, promoting and training not the different sectors to understand the balance of what we, at least in the USG, call the 3D approach: diplomacy, defense, and development working in tandem, all get at the promoting democratic principles and promoting the respect for human rights. I think to deliver on some of these key goals and to really exert the civilian oversight, there are policymakers like myself who have the opportunity to weigh in and sit in on conversations that allow for policy that has enduring effects on the oversight of the security sector and other sectors that have an influence in the governance process. I would say from a security perspective, there are a few things that have been put in the US government that allow us to be able to have that oversight. Besides, using the role of Congress and the committees that have oversight over the security sector, there are a number of laws that have been put into effect. Leahy laws that help us with vetting of our spending and the role of the security sector. There's Elie Wiesel's Genocide and Atrocities Prevention Act. There's Women, Peace, and Security as a core foundation of how we engage our partners. And I think all of these exemplify our commitment to stability and security sector accountability, but through various other tools that are used in the policy realm or used in our parliamentary or congressional oversight, as well as within our agencies. And so I would touch on some of those things as how we continue to build this from a civilian oversight. I think some of the maybe programming that we do as well is specific to institutional capacity building programs that allow for an inject of governance and transparency and accountability conversations. And so, we have the Institute for Security Governance, for example, that the Department of Defense supports, that allows us to enable partner nations to improve the accountability, the competency, and the governance of not just the security sector, but that role that security sector plays into the larger governance structure in governments. So
I'm looking at the watch. And so the topic of our closing plenary is creating a more effective global architecture for assistance, for security assistance. As you know, a new US law, the Global Fragility Act, was adopted last year, which requires US agencies to develop innovative 10-year conflict prevention and stabilization plans in a small set of countries, including some in Africa. So in this act, the new parliamentary directive requiring the state and defense department to ensure that as part of this stabilization plan, the US security cooperation includes safeguards to mitigate against corruption, human rights, and other security sector governance gaps. So, Ambassador Schuman, can international donors like the US and the Netherlands use legislative initiatives such as the GFA to pilot new joint cooperative efforts to improve security sector governance? So I'm looking at the global security sector governance architecture.
I think definitely we can use it, both I think at the national, but also at the international level. You know, setting norms and guidance is of critical enormous for basically, as I always say, you know, for us to help us to keep the eye on the goal and not on the ball, let alone on the man. And again, the goal is providing sustainable peace and security for everybody worldwide, and to live up to our mandates, which is to protect civilians, our civilians, or wherever we serve. And I think these kind of frameworks, they're built on lessons learned of what works, what not. Also, unfortunately, lessons learned of what went wrong, you know, but building on those, and those are costly mistakes in history. But to build on those as reminders on how we have a whole of government, but also a whole of international community approach to better delivering on the promise of lasting peace and security, is, I think, extremely helpful and a good basis for further cooperation, and designing also the visions of labor, comparative advantages, know from our different constituencies what the different capacities can do, but also what they cannot do and where we need each other. But again, starting from the common goal.
Yeah, and then we have done this before. I mean, in 2005, we had the Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness, where we laid out some common principles. I think it is possible. I'm very hopeful that is possible. And by then, what's the vision of the Department of Defense on an act such as the Global Fragility Act?
Well, I think I would agree with Ambassador Sherman on a number of points that she made. I think one, having it is very important. The lessons learned about collaboration and coordination, I think, can only help this new effort to be able to be a more effective tool than maybe some others that have been done in the past. And so really leaning in on some of the lessons learned will be critical. I think as far as a vision for what the USG will sort of prioritize from GFA, we really worked hard, I think, in a number of administrations to try and prioritize promoting stability. And so to that end, I think the Global Fragility Act is truly a bipartisan effort, and the vision of the legislation looking out to 10 years is an important step to just talk about prevention. And that's something that we haven't spent a lot of time doing. We spend a lot of time doing crisis response or responsive or being reactive. And so this look ahead to preventative measures will be key. I think, from where I sit at the Department of Defense, we have a myriad of tools to include, programs, some funding, and authorities to draw on our work to assist our diplomatic colleagues and development partners. And so we look forward to having an opportunity to do this. But I think, to another point that Ambassador Sherman made, beyond the whole of government approach, it has to be sort of a whole of society approach. And that is particularly for the US government, including more of the private sector into some of these areas and arenas where they may have not taken a role before, to expand the breadth of partners who are working in this space to get at some of the issues and challenges a lot faster.
Thanks. I'm afraid we are almost top of the hour. I will ask Ambassador Schuman, do you have any closing thoughts?
Maybe just to summarize, I think the takeaways for me from this is threefold. I think first is that we need to listen better to the local needs and be better in empowering local communities, because their needs should be central to any security sector governance and reform process, with, again, this ultimate shared goal of a sustainable, lasting peace and security for all. And that can be only sustainable when it's inclusive. The second one is, as I said, the security sector governance and reform should be embedded in broader political and development strategies. So technical assistance alone does not enhance accountability, transparency, legitimacy, and better service delivery. So inclusive and responsive governance is key. And the last one is what we just discussed. As international community, we have to get better in our collective analysis and coordinated action. And we need a shared strategy based on the needs and resilience of the women, men, girls, and boys that we're meant to serve. And we need endurance to stick to that strategy. So our efforts across the board need to amplify each other, especially when engaging within the security sector. And thank you for the opportunity to participate.
So thank you for participating indeed. And that's Blyden.
Let's maybe start with the last point, and that there's always an opportunity for countries and organizations who choose to commit to capacity building to collaborate and to coordinate more closely. I would say that includes working with the security sector, and I think, and continuing to engage the security sector for better governance, better competencies, and accountability will be key to promoting stability on the continent and around the world in a way that is lasting and enduring, given that inclusive nature of ensuring that all three components of the 3Ds are at the table from the start and not just there to be used as a tool. So I think emphasizing the building partner capacity and engagements and advocacy for democratic security governance initiatives will be key as we look forward to expanding the global architecture on democratic principles and governance.
Thank you, Das Blyden, and thank you, Ambassador Showman, for sharing your time and your expertise with us. In closing, I want to thank Humanity United, the Alliance for Peace Building, Search for Common Ground, and the U.S. Institute of Peace for designing and putting together this high-level event. I hope it was rewarding, and thank you again for joining, all of you. Thank you, and have a great day. Thanks.